There is a country where the government pays for your electricity, your water and your gas, where the capital city is made entirely of white marble and looks like a ghost town, where cars had to be white by law, but also where video games are banned, where the internet is censored, and where a dictator once renamed the months of the year after his own family. Welcome to Turkmenistan, the strangest country in the world that you have never heard of. When someone calls Turkmenistan one of the most closed dictatorships in the world, it does not sound like an exaggeration. International reports describe the country as a highly repressive state, with rights that are almost non-existent in practice and a suffocated press, which helps explain why so much about it seems hazy even to people who follow global politics. And that opacity, interestingly enough, is only the entry point. The first major sign that Turkmenistan would follow its own logic appeared with Sapar Murat Niyazov, who was not satisfied with simply ruling. He proclaimed himself Turkmenbashi, or Father of the Turkmens, turning the presidency into something far more symbolic and almost sacred. It was not just a pompous title, but a way of tying national identity to the figure of one man. And that opened the door to even more improbable measures. The situation became even more unusual when Niyazov wrote the Runama, the Book of the Soul, and elevated the work to an almost official level of national truth. The book became mandatory in schools, universities, and even driver's license exams, as if driving well also depended on absorbing the leader's ideological vision. The message was clear. In Turkmenistan, even ordinary tasks could be crossed by political loyalty, and that would soon invade even the calendar. Control became so personal that Niyazov did not want only to influence education or the country's symbols, he changed time itself. During his government, the months of the year and the days of the week were renamed after himself, his mother, and other references tied to his personal cult, as if even the calendar needed to repeat every day who was in charge. When a leader begins reorganizing something as basic as the way people count days, the strange stops being a detail and becomes a system. The logic of the regime went so far that even art had to fit within what power considered acceptable. Under Niyazov, opera, ballet, and the circus were banned for being seen as foreign to Turkmen culture, and even lip-synced performances came under official scrutiny. It was not just cultural censorship.
We need this resolved quickly. I understand, but we must follow procedure. Our community is counting on you. Order will be maintained. We are investigating. Thank you, officer.
Bodies usually become the next target. Control did not remain only in books, calendars, or stages. It also reached the face and the mirror. For years, beards and long hair entered the list of things that could be frowned upon or even banned for men, reinforcing the idea that, in Turkmenistan, appearance could also become a matter of political discipline. When power starts regulating even such basic personal traits, the message stops being symbolic and begins invading daily life in an almost suffocating way. And authoritarian eccentricity reached an almost caricatural point, when dogs were banned from Ashgabat because the leader considered their smell offensive to the capital. It sounds like an absurd detail, but it reveals something more serious. Even the presence of animals could be treated as a matter of public image, symbolic cleanliness, and aesthetic obedience. When a regime starts controlling even what can circulate in the streets, the city becomes a showcase, and not exactly a place for living together. If the country already seemed overly scripted, Ashgabat pushes that to another level. The capital entered Guinness for having the highest concentration of buildings covered in white marble, with more than 500 structures registered in that pattern. The effect is not only visual, it is psychological. The city gives off a sense of clean, artificial, and almost untouchable grandeur, as if every facade had been designed to impress first and explain later, which helps explain why, at night, everything becomes even stranger. And that is when Ashgabat stops seeming merely monumental and starts seeming almost unreal. At night, the wide avenues, perfectly lit buildings, and scarcity of pedestrians create the feeling of a ghost city built to be seen, not lived in. Several accounts describe exactly that strangeness, as if the capital functioned more like a choreographed showcase than a spontaneous urban space. And when appearance becomes the priority, even the cost of living there takes on a very particular logic. And the contrast becomes even more unsettling when material life enters the picture. For many years, the Turkmen state maintained a policy of broad subsidies for housing and services such as electricity, gas, and water, creating the image of a country where the basics seemed almost free for much of the population. But that benefit was never just economic generosity. It also helped reinforce dependence, control, and apparent stability, a logic that sets the stage for the country's most famous crater. And then comes the image that made Turkmenistan break through the bubble of anonymity. The Darvaza gas crater, known all over the world as the Gates of Hell. Formerly linked to the Darvaza region, in the middle of the Karakum Desert, it looks like something invented for a movie, a flaming pit burning for decades. But the most curious thing is that this apocalyptic postcard does not contradict the country. It perfectly sums up the mixture of isolation, spectacle, and energy that defines what comes next. The Gates of Hell is not just an impressive image. It makes sense within a country sitting on a gigantic amount of natural gas. Turkmenistan is among the countries with the largest proven reserves on the planet, which helps explain both its strategic importance and several internal contradictions of the regime. In other words, the fire that draws attention in the desert is only the visible version of an underground wealth that shapes almost everything there. And this whole logic of isolation becomes even more understandable when you look at the map. About 80% of Turkmenistan is occupied by the Karakum Desert, one of the largest in Asia. That is not just a nice geographic detail to mention. It is a condition that influences movement, settlement, infrastructure, and even the sense of distance the country conveys. In a place like that, emptiness is not just landscape. It becomes part of the very structure of power and of the next national obsession. But Turkmenistan is not made only of desert, marble, and control. It also cultivates one of the most elegant symbols in all of Central Asia. Akal Tike horses, originating in Turkmen territory, became famous for their endurance, refined silhouette, and coat with a metallic shine that sometimes looks golden under the light. It is not hard to understand why so many people call them the most beautiful in the world, and in a country obsessed with image, that says more than it seems. And as if white marble and monumentality was still not enough, Ashgabat also became known for putting up golden structures and monuments so excessive that they seem to compete with reality itself. Between towers, national symbols, and elements that rotate at the top to reinforce presence and grandeur, the capital becomes a kind of scenic park of power. When architecture stops serving only the city and starts staging authority, even the landscape begins to obey. If the city seems quiet in the streets, the internet helps explain why. In Turkmenistan, online access is rigidly controlled. Human rights organizations report massive domain blocking, and even popular platforms like YouTube and WhatsApp appear among the services blocked for ordinary users. In practice, that does not limit only entertainment, but also contact, information, and comparison with the outside world, which makes isolation much deeper than it seems. And that blockage does not stay only within digital borders. It also appears in the way the country controls who may look at it up close. Press freedom organizations describe Turkmenistan as one of the most closed environments in the world for journalism, with local media rigidly controlled and very little space for independent coverage, which helps explain why reporting from inside the country remains so rare. Behind the official shine, there is a much less attractive machine. Cotton, treated as white gold, was for a long time linked to the forced mobilization of workers during the harvest period.
Is this the daily log?
Recent reports still point to pressure on public sector
employees. Can we get a shot of the towers?
And records involving children in the 2024
Stay behind the line.
Which shows how a commodity celebrated by the state can hide human costs that are almost invisible to those who only look at the surface. Even a piece of data that should be simple, such as the size of the population, enters Turkmenistan's fog zone. Although current international estimates point to something above 7 million, specialists and reports have questioned the official numbers for years and suggest that the real population may be much smaller because of emigration, low transparency, and statistical control. In a country like this, even counting people becomes a political issue, and that helps explain why information in general is so scarce. In Turkmenistan, the lack of information is not a side effect. It is part of how the country works. Recent reports indicate that the state maintains almost total control over access to content, blocks websites of foreign outlets and independent media, and strongly restricts what the population can compare with the outside world. That is why understanding the country also requires reading the silences, and it is precisely within that silence that an ancient tradition continues to endure. But reducing Turkmenistan to censorship, desert, and monumentality would mean missing an essential layer of the country: culture. The traditional art of making Turkmen carpets was inscribed by UNESCO on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, not only because of the beauty of the pieces, but because their patterns carry tribal memory, identity, and historical continuity. In a place so politically controlled, it is curious to realize how tradition still preserves codes much older than the regime. That cultural continuity also appears in the language. Turkmen belongs to the Oghuz branch of the Turkic languages, the same group that includes Turkish, which helps explain similarities in structure, vocabulary, and sound, while the historical proximity with other Central Asian peoples also creates points of contact with neighboring languages such as Uzbek. To an outside observer, that may seem like a linguistic detail, but there, language also functions as a clue to belonging and to much older cultural alliances.
My friend, life teaches us patience, indeed, and tea helps with that. It does. How is your family? They are well, thank you. I'm glad.
To erase.
We are fortunate.
Traditional Turkmen weddings can last several days and usually bring together rituals, farewells, music, food, and performances that connect family, community, and cultural memory in the same event. It is as if, for a few days, the country stepped out of the marble and official rigidity to reveal a much more human layer, although not even that sphere completely escapes the state's gaze. The predominant religion in Turkmenistan is Sunni Islam, but that does not mean broad freedom of practice. International reports show that the government maintains rigid control over religious activities, supervises leadership, limits groups, and even interferes in the space where faith may exist publicly. In other words, even in a dimension that in many countries organizes social life spontaneously, religion there also passes through the filter of the state, and even so the human factor insists on appearing. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this. Despite the control, the silence, and the official rigidity, many travel accounts describe Turkmens as hospitable, welcoming, and genuinely curious about foreigners. That contrast is what makes the country so difficult
Here is your
to fit
tea.
into easy labels.
Thank you. Let's discuss the
Because it
housing
shows
issue.
that a regime can
Yes,
be
the repairs are
extremely
urgently
closed
needed.
without
I agree.
completely
The timeline is
erasing the
crucial.
warm
We can start
human
next week.
dimension
Excellent. We will
of those
proceed.
who live within it. And that is exactly what ties together the whole mystery of Turkmenistan. In the end, Turkmenistan reveals one uncomfortable thing. A country can seem silent, organized, and even scenic on the outside, and still hide deep layers of control, isolation, and fear. But it also shows another less obvious truth. Even within extremely rigid systems, culture, tradition, and hospitality continue surviving in ways that power does not fully control. Maybe that is why Turkmenistan is so intriguing, because it forces us to realize that understanding a place is not about looking only at its monuments, its headlines, or its official rules, but at what people live in the space between all that. And maybe that is the best lesson for any journey. The places that are hardest to decipher are almost always the ones that reveal the most about human behavior. If you enjoy this kind of curiosity that goes beyond the surface, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which of these facts surprised you the most.